Dzień dobry Państwu, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na końcowej debacie.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the last debate of the event that started yesterday afternoon. And then we've had several panels yesterday afternoon, today morning, and today in the afternoon. And the final panel is devoted to the place of Poland is in Europe, which collides with another important event in Warsaw that's taking place in Warsaw now. And let me apologize, but we're going to start in 5 or 10 minutes because we're still waiting for Jasina, for one of the panelists. I'm very sorry for the delay. And in order to engage you somehow, I'm going to introduce the panelists that are already with us, starting from Karolina Pomorska, who is an assistant professor, political scientist from the university in Cambridge and in Maastricht. She deals with European integration, including Polish European policy. The next panelist is Marcin Kędzierski, director of the Analysis Center of the Jagiellonian Club from Krakow, Poland. Rather, Krakow, then Warsaw, but the Jagiellonian Club is present also in Warsaw now. And to the right of Mr. Kędzierski, Michał Sutowski, political scientist, representative of Krytyka Polityczna. In a minute, I hope that Łukasz Jasina will join us. He's a historian representing Kultura Liberalna. Different societies, different intellectual societies are represented in this panel. Left wing, Sutowski liberal approach of Mr. Jasina, conservative approach, if I may say so, and a neutral, non-ideological community based on common sense, represented by Karolina Pomorska. Maciej Zagrodzki, well, it's difficult to say what approach he represents. He will be the chairman of this debate. I'm a journalist, and I always wanted to be an impartial journalist, and I did an internship at BBC, and we had classes in independent journalism. And at the end of that class, the professor said, we know we know what it means to be impartial, but at the end we need to determine who we are impartial against or towards. Okay, I think that Łukasz will join us with some delay. We can't do anything about it, but I suggest we start now. And let's hope that the liberal approach will join us very soon. I hope this debate will be pleasant. I hope the discussion will be interesting. And give the floor to Mr. Sutowski. Okay, the guests have been introduced already, and now I would like to provoke you by saying that you deal with the European external affairs policy, something which in fact does not exist. How does it feel to deal with something that does not exist? This is something that we are going to get back later. The 4th of July that was mentioned before makes me think about what will happen. Well, we don't know what will happen, so it makes no sense thinking about it and wondering about it. But what I can remember from 1989, in February there was a meeting held in Europe, and during that meeting one of the representatives of Poland from the Ministry of International Affairs said that maybe the Iron Curtain will collapse, maybe Germany will be united, and everyone laughed in that room. This was in February 1989, and everyone laughed at this idea. Let me remind you of this event today. In the anniversary of free elections of 1989 in Poland. Today, the dynamics of change are not as visible as in the past. However, the world is taking a turn now. And I would like to start a debate by referring to a recent second round of presidential election, the runoff of presidential elections in Austria. There was a candidate of the Freedom Party taking part in the runoff elections, and then it turned out that the candidate supported by the Green Party won eventually, but it was close. And this shows that the world can really change very soon, and that the elections in France may be won by Marine Le Pen. Also, Jobbik is gaining in power. I visited Hungary a few days ago, and this party is really gaining in strength, gaining in power. Real Finns maybe they are not gaining in power, but for example, the Alternative for Germany is becoming increasingly popular. What's the reason for these trends? And how can this change the situation in Europe? How can it turn Europe upside down and make it turn into a totally new direction? Okay, I will begin. I'm really glad that you start with this topic. I was trying to look at different panels during these 2 days event, and this topic was present in almost every debate, so it's worth addressing in the final panel as well. On the one hand, just like you've mentioned, we cannot exaggerate. These parties are gaining in power. We discussed also transatlantic alliance and Trump. They also face increasing popularity. On the other hand, they have not gained power yet. On the other hand, this trend can be observed in Europe. In the past, it was said that that such parties constituted the so-called normal pathology. They emerged and then disappeared. They emerged during different crises and then they disappeared. And then now we talk about pathological normality. These parties are something that we need to get used to, and we need to cope with them. We need to cope with questioning our values. These parties are rooted in frustration, in resentments of different kinds, and I think that we're beginning to understand why these parties emerge in Europe. Thank you for the invitation. I would refer to the history. This is nothing extraordinary that such parties emerge. When we have a look on the history of political thinking, we have the 16th century and Machiavelli and the notion of raison d'être. And then we had different ideas in Germany, in France and Ukraine, and Poland was a kind of exception. In Poland, nationalist thinking emerged later, and now the nationalist movement proves how marginal it is in Poland when compared to Finland or to Hungary. I think that it would be exaggerated to say that such movements are very strong in Poland. However, at the end of the 19th century, national states were beginning to emerge. Later on, after the First World War, the situation changed as a result of the atrocities of the World War, the economic crisis, so these parties naturally emerged. But today, well, we know that the ideas presented by these parties were not the best ideas possible. So why do these parties emerge again today? I think that this comeback is quite understandable because people feel intimidated. They felt intimidated for several years now. There are problems related to capitalism now, neoliberalism, and people feel that they are intimidated by the capitalism they have to face, and they seek help in a state. And they think that national state is something much more plausible than the help provided by Brussels. However, this is a paradox, because there was a German political scientist who said that the Christianity in the 21st century will either be mystical or there will be no Christianity. And let me paraphrase it. The European Union will either be transnational in the 21st century, or it will cease to exist. And when we look at the revival of national movements all over Europe, also in Poland, and I'm opposed to popular thinking that if we want to be in the European Union, we have to make it stronger. And there are increasing tensions and growing gaps between elites and society, between regulated capitalism and democracy. And this shows that today the question about the future shape of the European Union is irrelevant. The question should rather be posed, what will happen after the European Union? Maybe we could be provocative and say that the European Union has ceased to exist, and how should Poland adjust to this situation? Well, the European Union is still there. However, it's very interesting to hear a capitalist saying that, a conservative saying that we've got some issues with capitalism now. Yeah, also after the First World War, capitalism was the crucial element, and the crisis of capitalism of 1929 increased the frustration caused by the atrocities of the First World War, although we may say that the Italian fascism emerged without any problems with capitalism being there. And since 1914, since the end of the First World War, people started to think about new political ideas. And they were wondering how to deal with the new reality that capitalism brought. These were different ideas, socialist ideas and ideas of other kinds. On the other hand, after the First World War, which we tend to forget, was the time when Europe did not believe in parliamentary democracy, especially in 1930s. We tend to focus on Germany and Italy, but apart from Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, all the countries were based on dictatorships with more or less social legitimacy. And it put an end to this model of parliamentary democracy. This was the overriding feeling in 1930s. And people felt that the political systems, for example, liberal democracy, in a very deep sense, so I'm not talking about the rule of democratic government with protection for minorities and limitations for the authorities, but in a very deep sense, in the parliamentary sense, organized at the level of a national state. This system does not fulfill its own promise to provide well-being and welfare to the citizens of these states. Because this was the aim of the integration of Poland with the European Union. We want to enjoy welfare that the European countries enjoyed after the Second World War. We had to cope with a series of crises in 2008, 2009. In 2001, we had to deal with the dot-com bubble, a series of minor crises that accumulated into a big crisis in 2008, in 2009, led to significant changes in political thinking. And as a result, new concepts emerged. Why nationalism? Well, the most simple answer is that this formula is already known. Cosmopolitization, globalization, post-nationality can be treated as a kind of distortion, as a kind of mistake that led to the problems. So we can get back to the ideas that are well known. And I'm talking about national states now. Of course, this idea is also distorted. However, in collective imagination, this is how nationalists succeed. Well, this is much more complicated because in the old states of the European Union, along with the increase of these national parties, there is also a growing frustration towards the European Union. However, in our part of Europe, the situation is more complicated. Even in Hungary, that is given much coverage nowadays, surveys show that over 70% of people are pleased with European integration and with the fact that Hungary is a member of the European Union. We know that Poles support our presence within the European Union. On the other hand, we are referring to nation states. We are paying more attention to our own sovereignty. We want to care about our own interests. So on the one hand, we've got the willingness to be a member of the European Union. But on the other hand, we refer to a large extent to nation states.
Take the example of the Netherlands. You're saying that Europe is no longer sexy, and let's remember this is just a certain percentage of the society. For instance, in the Netherlands, last November, the Dutch suggested to continue integration in a small group of countries, the hardcore of the EU, which is the Benelux countries, Austria and Germany. whether or not this was a serious proposal or whether or not it was supposed to just scare off certain partners, well, we can actually argue about this, but there might be more integration as a response from other countries. So it's not the case that everybody agrees that the EU is non-existent anymore. We heard it during this event and others that, of course, the response might be a reform of the EU, but there is no comeback to nation states because we are not able to address those challenges in the sphere of security at the level of nation states. And now it's a battle of ideas, it's a battle of concepts. And this battle has to be fought. And we just need to be in the core. Well, it's going to happen just very soon, the British referendum, and it's in Poland's interest for the UK to stay in the EU. And we are too small a player in the global game, in American Chinese game with the Russian component. So it's in our interest. But the question would be to you: where does this high support for the EU in Poland come from? Within the cohesion policy, we still perceive the EU in the context of our infrastructural investments, with EU flags everywhere. We are driving along motorways, which we didn't used to have, and we swim in swimming pools and so on. But if the cohesion policy is gone, if this is a project-based financing policy, take a look at the Juncker plan. You have prioritizing of different investments. What do you think will be the percentage of the Central Eastern European projects that got funding? Not a single project got funding from this part of Europe, not just because they don't like it. Maybe we're not ready for it institutionally. The framework programs for research and development, Polish universities don't get as much as Poland pays into the EU budget, just because Poland's not ready yet. And there might be a multitude of reasons, reasons such as our lobbying in the European Commission. We have 20 lobbyists, Germans have around 1,000 lobbyists, so institutionally we're weaker. And as long as cohesion policy is gone, in the sense that Poland will no longer get a specific amount of money, and we will have to fight on par with other countries, the support for the EU will start falling. One other view, which is not very popular in a conservative community, because they tend to be very realistic, but let's think about it constructively. We're talking about the Europe of nations, and we're going to wonder about Poland, UK, and France in 30 years. It might be a very different country versus today. Germany, France, and other countries. For immigration, for demographic reasons, there will be a very different picture. So the future of the EU, and when we're talking about this and about the hardcore integration, whether or not this will happen, the founding fathers of the EU might reintegrate, but then the European continent will look very different. Germany will be a different country. France will be a different country, and it might not even be 30 years, it might as well be even 10 years, and the voter population will change. So if we're discussing national movements, they will grow more powerful, but the nationalism will change its face because the structure of voter population will change as well. Going back to the British case, we have heard a lot about it, but I think follow-up of the first part of this debate. Until recently, until the Treaty of Lisbon, there was not even a single paragraph on exiting the EU. It was unthinkable. People wouldn't even consider exiting. It was an ever closer union. And of course, the translation was very different into different languages. But in the moment, we might see there is no other payee or net payer into the EU budget, and even if there is one left, then of course the agreement between the UK and the EU is also a start of disintegration, because what we might see, it will be other countries saying, oh, we want that kind of agreement as well, let's exclude this and let's exclude that. So what we see in Poland being criticized very often, and Guy Verhofstadt very often says, well, hey, let's stop the opt-out things. We really want to have a normal organization, and let's stop just giving some concessions to everyone all the time. Thank you and welcome. Hi, Łukasz. Yes. At the other end of this spectrum, we have Europe a la carte. Choose from the menu whatever you wish, which is very difficult because there are some integration mechanisms which are a tit-for-tat kind of mechanisms. You agree to something and you accept something which might be less favorable to you, just going for the whole solution, getting a balanced solution. And this potential Brexit is interesting in the sense that if Britain exits, let's put it differently. If the British do not exit and stay within the EU, we're going to see a vision of Europe of two speeds, which could be the Carolinian speed, if you like. Germany, France, and all the satellites. Benelux is kind of, with due respect, kind of a satellite thing. And of course, it's much more significant than Poland, no question about that, in the political sense. But anyway, that vision will theoretically become likely, and it might be somehow close to the vision that the Polish government now pursues. So they want to be part of the UK, as a follow-up of the UK within the EU, which will be kind of the outer ring. And that's very much in line with what you said. It's not that Western Europeans are Eurosceptical. They might be skeptical about the EU, which exists now, with all the lazy people from the south and all the wild and crazy people from the east. If this were a Europe of nice and wealthy and cool people from the west with Protestant ethics of work plus France, because France doesn't have the Protestant ethos of work, but it has wines in Paris, so it's really hard to imagine EU, the core of EU, without France. But anyway, if we have this subdivision into two Europes, well, that seems quite realistic. Poland is sometimes viewed as the north of Europe. That's a good question, actually. There are two themes. Firstly, it might well be that Poland does not really fit within the core. When Jürgen Habermas used to write about the tightening of European integration, and the question was who should be in the core, and he said, well, Western Europe plus Poland could be this part of Europe without the South plus Poland. And this was the politically correct consensus in Germany in a neutral sense. But today, it's not like the Law and Justice Party has ruined Poland's reputation. Well, to some extent it did. But the most important thing is that the Polish government at the moment does not imagine getting into the core of Europe and joining this part of Europe. We recently got a draft for the discussion, like what if? Let's imagine Marine Le Pen wins the elections in France, and then we have a problem. Marine Le Pen could be skeptical, even towards Europe, which would be following the Carolinian project. What kind of Carolinian project can there be without France? So I'm talking about the Western European countries or Latin countries. Well, we know what we mean. So should France refuse to join, well, this project will not happen. There will be no core Europe and the ring of Europe, outside rings, and now we are going to have a concept of superpowers. We have superpower of France and of Germany, perhaps Italy, well, who knows? The UK, who knows? And on this axis, Warsaw is not going to be another town. It's going to be the city which is further down the east. Łukasz, let me give you some space to say something. There is a lot of talk about disappointment and people being disappointed with overregulation and people sitting in Brussels being paid money and not coming up with any useful ideas. We recently had a panel discussion about capital and about does capital have nationality? And there was a proof that capital does have nationality because PISA, which is a Poland's company, train company, they've been wanting to sell their trains to Germany, and they have been trying to get the official registration in Germany. Well, they had to get official registration in Germany. Today they managed to do it, but it's just because they use German machinery to produce their trains and cars and rail cars. Otherwise, there is no system in Europe that would have allowed that earlier. So if we're talking about ever closer Europe, let's integrate on important issues. A Polish train driver, he has to have a special authorization to enter the German border on a train. So after so many years of integration, maybe Europe should get integrated in those things that do matter. Well, to begin with, I was halted or held up by the 4th of June demonstrations in the streets in Warsaw, so that's why I got late. But anyway, going back to integration on important matters, there used to be a film in Poland called Conversation Under Control. And there was a funny general who was speaking on TV during a Christmas, New Year's Eve party. And he said, well, did it have to happen that the martial law was introduced in Poland? Well, apparently it had to be introduced because it was introduced. So this is a quote, and we can look at European Union in the same light. We got integrated in some issues, and the EU managed to come to an agreement, sign documents, issue directives and legal acts and so on. And there are some areas and some issues where EU countries were unable to integrate or to agree on, and lots of matters were left to the jurisdiction of nation states. And I think back in previous decades, the atmosphere was much better to carry on the integration versus 2016. In the past, Eurosceptics were actually afraid of speaking out. This subdivision into young Europe and old Europe, and this idea of a Carolinian project is still there. My impression is that this year and next year, no matter what happens, if the nightmare actually happens, meaning Brexit, France and Donald Trump winning, and then there are a few other things, and a vision of some land where the alternative for Germany will win. So there might be some sequences of events which will not be conducive to integration. If we want to agree on integration in certain areas, politicians really must be free of fear. And there might be less of anxiety and less of caution in societies. At the moment, there are some people who think that we are going to be rescued by the core of Europe, but the number is shrinking. Look at the debate in Germany. When we have the debate about the core of Europe in case of Brexit, there is more and more of a discussion of what Germany should do should the EU collapse. And I think even the most rational country of Europe, when they talk about the EU, they do consider this scenario. And I agree with Michał. Actually, we all almost always agree. We must admit that. Well, sometimes we discuss political issues in terms of history, and we sometimes disagree. Anyway, whatever we do, from a purely national point of view, even though national is a tricky word in Poland nowadays, but anyway, from a national view in Poland, none of those scenarios is actually favorable for Poland, and it doesn't really matter if the current ruling party is at power or not. It's just that the atmosphere has changed. It was beneficial and favorable for Poland and for the perception of Poland, and now we're going to talk mostly about ourselves. And Poland doesn't have too many. Poland doesn't have to move. Doesn't have to have too many moves to make. It needs an ally. It needs to make geopolitical choices to find support, and very few people in our country are ready for that. The current party has an advantage of asking questions about those geopolitical choices, even though they make false choices largely. But anyway, I'm really afraid that this might trigger all the fears and all the traumas that Poles have in their minds, and this will act to our detriment. Going back to your question about integration on important matters, I think it's quite easy to speak in words, let's integrate in important matters such as transport policy. But if we go to France, the UK or the Netherlands, everybody will give us a very different example of what matters. In the south, we will hear refugees, migration policy, that's important. Let's go to EK, and they will say the TTIP is very important, and we should really make sure that there is a solution. And that's why we have the principle of solidarity in the European treaties. We know what is important, and we support you in this policy, and you help us in another policy. Just to interrupt very quickly, when I spoke about important matters, I was thinking of a different example. To me, it's quite unusual. The summer season is starting in almost all EU countries. There is a different alcohol level in blood allowable for drivers. So if you're driving from Germany towards Poland, you can have your beer, you can have your sausage, the police will stop you and say, it's okay, move on. But if you enter with the same level of alcohol in blood into the Czech Republic, your driver's license will be taken away. So integration in important matters looks like this, even though you might disregard alcohol in blood levels. But anyway, for people who are enemies of the EU, those situations show that there's something wrong. And I mean the famous or infamous bananas. Nobody says, it's just because of transport reasons. People just are saying, those idiots are wondering about how curvy or straight a banana should be. So this integration, let's not escape it. It's overall quite good, but it should really serve our purpose. I can say I quite agree with you, but the policy which we used to refer to high-level policy, like foreign policy vis-à-vis Russia, that's important as well. You were saying no foreign policy. We do have sanctions. They're very important for Poland, but some countries were actually frowning. I talked to diplomats who were there in faces, and they were saying, yes, I did see the Hungarian frown or the German frown, but they did not mention the national interests. It was unthinkable in the Council at that time when the crisis happened. It was unthinkable to refer to national interests. There was some solidarity that did work. When somebody asks us to show solidarity in the case of refugees, we are failing this test in Poland, and I think we do need to take part in the future integration, but I am not going to be surprised if we're not invited, because people will say, where is your solidarity? Where is your loyalty? And so we cannot be very selective and pick out all the cherries. Let's carry on with solidarity and immigration, and let's combine it, because some people think that the migration conflict is the most serious conflict for the EU, and other people think that it might radically overturn Europe or modify it. France is going to be a different country. Austria is going to have 30% of Muslims in 10 or 15 years. So just two sentences, not about migration, and then I'll move on. The solidarity about sanctions. The case was Angela Merkel. She actually smashed Viktor Orban. And she forced him to have those sanctions just because German factories got a request from the Kanzleramt to withhold the production in Hungary. So it wasn't actually, a sense of solidarity. It was a brutal pressure of the stronger one onto the weaker player. We need to be open about this. About migration crisis, in the situation we're in, the migration crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the North-South crisis, and the security crisis, mostly in the East, these are three crises that cannot really be viewed separately. Why is that? Because they directly affect the situation. Suppose the south of Europe didn't have 40% of unemployment among the young people, then the inflow of refugees wouldn't have been such a problem for obvious reasons, such as bad economic sentiment, or overall we're having a problem of employing people in the long run. So we have those stories, after all, the demography and the labor market in Europe, calls for or leaves some room for refugees. Well, it might look very good on paper, but if they have 40% of young people unemployed in Spain or Greece, then the question is, how come do we really need migrants if we have no jobs for our own youth? And I'm not saying this is the only problem, but this fact actually aggravates the migration crisis. And those three crises that I mentioned, they do affect Europe for very simple reasons, geographic reasons. South is most strongly affected by the refugee problem, and Germany as the target country, not because Angela Merkel invited refugees to Germany. It's just Germany is the richest country and it's a big country, so refugees just actually head for Germany. The Eastern crisis, of course, affects very strongly ourselves and the Baltic states, and moderately it affects France, and not to mention Greeks or Italians. But the economic crisis in the Eurozone is distributed it's yet differently. There are some people who are winners and some who are losers. But anyway, what I'm heading at is saving the integration pact is something that depends on connecting those three crises, and I don't really have a ready-made solution, but we need to say that it's really true that we do care more about Russia, whereas Italians or Greeks have the right to care less about Russia, and they are more concerned about refugees, and we're less concerned here in Poland about refugees, and there is this objective situation. So we need to find a trade-off or strike a deal and agree to accept a number of refugees. Well, some of them will move on to Germany anyway, but anyway, we're talking about principles. So we need to recognize that this is our problem, whereas Italians might agree that the threat of Baltic states being attacked is their problem. We're in the same boat, even though we have different problems, and that's why we need to support one another. This is the only way for the EU to really keep it together.
I would agree with Michał, especially with respect to some issues. we really need to say that this is the crisis of the European Union, which is unable to cope with the issues. Not because there are more issues nowadays than in the past. There have always been wars going on. However, Europe has become more vulnerable to all these threats. Its immunity system is weaker now. And I'm quite pessimistic because we have no idea how to convince the European nations to strike a deal. We act as one body, and we agreed on that some time ago, and this was the idea behind any enlargement of the European Union. We should show solidarity towards one another. Now, a lot of European Union nations start to think in nationalist terms. And now we may check how we can cope with this weaker European Union. Everyone is trying to assess and evaluate how much they can gain for themselves. And people are not convinced of the European Union as a general idea. We treat the European Union as a solution that can help improve our well-being. And this is not going to change in the next years. The situation is even going to worsen. Okay, Poland could accept 7,000 refugees. No one would even see the difference, and this would improve our image in Europe. However, you said that we have to we have to show how loyal we are in order to be invited to sit at the table and hold negotiations and hold talks with other European nations. Well, that's not true. Poland is a relatively large country, and it is in the interests of the European Union for Poland to be within the European Union, because we are an important market. For example, for Germany, if they want to get the money they invested in the European integration back, they need our market. Our market is important for them. Germany is also a beneficiary of the integration idea, of the integration project and the enlargement process. I have to interrupt you. Today we very often hear that despite being beneficiaries as well, they ask themselves, why did we engage in this integration project? Well, this is a different kind of a problem that is related to the global issues, the increase in the importance of China, weakening of America, and the change of Russian politics after 2007 changed the global geopolitical structure, and Europe has to get used to the fact that it is located somewhere on the periphery and not in the very center of the world. And it's very difficult to solve the European problems in this context. Nowadays, Poland needs to be prepared for all the strategies, for all the scenarios. The European Union may grow more powerful. This may happen, and Poland must have a scenario for this. However, it may also turn out that the European Union does not grow more powerful, and it is Poland that has to grow more powerful then. And whether the European Union survives or not, it does not depend from us in the long term. We have to be prepared for all the scenarios, for all the possibilities. The more powerful we are in terms of economy and in terms of our army, the more influence we can exert on the whole world. What can we do now to strengthen our position? Well, we certainly have to do something, because we have no influence on whether the European Union survives or not. Well, I think that the European Union will survive. The question is in what shape it will survive. The European Union will also survive without Poland, and the question is whether Poland will survive without the European Union. It may look different from the outside. And let me say the following. I'm not going to agree with you. The image is very crucial in foreign relations. There have been many proofs for the fact that the image is of importance. In 2007, the image of Poland was very bad because of the Law and Justice government. And this was the only time that the Polish government forced the European Union to help Poland. It was connected to the embargo on meat imposed by Russia. So this was the only instance of the European Union acting in the interests of Poland. Well, back then, I was in the European Council, and the image of Poland decreased in the long run. There were proposals by the Finnish presidency, and this was a kind of a show only, a mere show. Maybe this was necessary in Polish-Russia relations. Maybe, we don't know that. However, the image of Poland within the European Union was bad at that time, and this was confirmed by many European diplomats of all levels. We may take part in the European market without sitting at the negotiation table. The fact whether we are consulted in important matters depends on how we behave, and the cooperation within the Weimar Triangle is weaker now. But what's the opinion on Erdogan in Brussels? Well, this is a crisis situation, and a deal was struck. But paradoxically, some Polish decision makers aim at gaining the position that Erdogan has. They want hardcore deals. They want Poland to become an important member, irrespective of whether the Polish image is good or bad. And in the last 10 years, we've got used to thinking that Poland is not very important for the European Union, that Poland has to think all the time how to become more powerful, how to grow more powerful within the European Union. I think that irrespective of how we behave, we should sit at the negotiation table within the European Union. But at the same time, we need to remember that there is a lot at stake. Our image cannot deteriorate too much, because this will have very detrimental consequences. We've got problems such as Brexit, Trump nowadays, and no one will remember about Timmermans in the future. And let's hope that we won't see these negative developments happen in the future, but they are possible. When it comes to the image of Poland, I think it's quite typical, because in comparison to Turkey, which behaves as it behaves, whose image is really poor, Turkey has so many assets, and its geopolitical location is so important that it was able to refuse to allow the American air forces to enter during the Iraqi war, and nothing happened to them. Someone of you mentioned Morawiecki. When I have a look at the proposal of the financing of the plan of Morawiecki, it turns out that half of these funds are going to come from the European Union, 38% from the European Union. European Investment Bank and a couple of institutions, European institutions, or the institutions that are influenced by European institutions. So in order to use these funds according to the plan of Morawiecki, we will be able to renegotiate financial frameworks for the coming years. You said that no one's going to remember who Timmermans was in a couple of years, but I think that the European Commission will remember what's happening in Poland nowadays when we have very important issues to discuss at stake. Regional operational programs and so on and so forth. The plan of Morawiecki shows how important the atmosphere is. If the atmosphere is not right, the European Commission won't be ready to put a blind eye to issues such as financial subsidies for mines in Poland. Or issues such as climate. In this sense, the image, public relations, and the atmosphere matters and influences whether the European Union turns a blind eye to some aspects that we have problems with. For example, negotiations concerning Nord Stream 2. The European Union has not decided yet what its approach on the new Russian pipeline is going to be. Some time ago, Gazprom protected us from gas contract, and the European Union acted according to the Polish interests then. The European Commission was against Gazprom and treats Gazprom as an opponent to a large extent. So issues such as Nord Stream, such as subsidies for different investments, developmental investments in Poland, these are the areas where the European institutions will take into account the atmosphere, the image of Poland. Well, the European institutions are fighting against one another when it comes to the sphere of influence. The Council is playing an important role now, but the Council is not going to help us. Yes, you're right. But today, the Commission is not as big an ally of Poland as it used to be some time ago. Commission is playing in the interests of Germany and other large member states. For example, compensations for refugees. This was a German proposal. They knew that they cannot put forward this proposal, so they decided to do it through the Commission. Yes, we've got lobbying, informal pressure. I'm always allergic to hearing you say that the European Union forces us to do something, imposes certain decisions on us. It's always a matter of taking joint decisions within the European institutions. We have our representatives in the European institutions. We should have more lobbyists within the European institutions. And we cannot create the impression that there are certain solutions imposed on us, that we have no influence on what's going on in the European Union. The activity of our government should consist in looking for allies when dealing with particular matters, particular issues. We all know what the voting in the European Union looks like. Double majority, we may not like it, but this rule is there, and we have to take the advantage of it. Okay, this discussion has already lasted for an hour, and maybe it's high time we invited you to take the floor, to ask some questions. There is a question from the back of the room.
Dzień dobry.
Good afternoon, Mikołaj Soik, University of Warsaw. I hope you can hear me. I would like to thank you for so many important remarks. My question is not related to Poland and the European Union. You know much about the European Union as such, and I would like to ask about the Union as the organization. The European Union should try to increase cooperation, to be closer to ordinary citizens, so that we can feel that the European Union is not alienated from its citizens, but is closer to the citizens. On the other hand, I still have the impression, I'm talking about political and economic questions now, hard politics, high-level politics, and it seems to me that we neglect the issue of Europeanization of culture. For example, Umberto Eco said that one of the best problems, the best projects proposed by the European Union was Erasmus, and that there should be Erasmus programs in different areas, not only in education, because this allows us to make sure that we bring up Europeans that are going to support the European integration project in the future. What's your idea about the idea fix of the European Union in the future? What can the European Union do to increase the support of ordinary citizens for the European project?
Mówił pan o rzeczy, które...
You were saying about something which probably works best in Europe, all the cultural unification, the disappearance of barriers, which have been working for the EU very well. And now there is a new generation in Europe, and we can see it in two ways, because in many countries of the new union, people are beginning to ask questions and challenge things which used to be obvious for us, such as Poland having to be in the EU and playing this role and not any other. So this is a new situation. You also mentioned EU citizens counteracting the union. The fact that we are speaking like this, it testifies to a gigantic crisis in the EU, because we used to think the EU was us. Nowadays, there are the national narratives before the Brexit, and now the thinking is ourselves versus the European Commission, or ourselves as European structures. So we're demonizing the EU. This actually is a symptom of the crisis, and the crisis might actually expand. If we're thinking about the reform, then we are thinking about changing the existing structures and creating something new. Actually, it's not really a problem specific to Poland. It has been noticed elsewhere as well. Very often, it is the smoke screen that Polish country, Poland and many other countries used, and they blame and badmouth the European Commission. You mentioned the Erasmus project. I don't know if you have been abroad many times, but I'm always happy there are no roaming fees, and very soon there will be none. There are still some, but they're much lower now. So in this context, I would like to say that the media play an important role, and politicians also play an important role in how they present the EU. A Swiss institute did a study on BBC, and it turned out that the objective and neutral TV, BBC, presented the European Union worse than they did Putin in recent years. So how can you expect a different perception? I cannot really justify that or give excuses, but this is an interesting thing to know. As for cultural collaboration, I think the problem is the accessibility and availability, and who takes advantage of the scholarships, the student exchanges and other things. People who do are usually Euro enthusiasts or critical Euro enthusiasts, and they maybe sympathize with indignados or all the new movements that are pro-European, criticizing specific institutions but really wanting to have a united Europe. But I think it's much more problematic to reach through to other people. Considering the social and economic situation today, I think at a place where the EU should actually demonstrate that it's doing something for the citizens, there should be some social solidarity solutions. When the common market was created, and in the times of Jacques Delors, the joint economic sphere was designed, and I think Jacques Delors treated it seriously, the idea of social Europe, and this is a response to that trend. And there was a dismantling of the welfare state that was happening at the time, but it wasn't very visible throughout Europe, maybe apart from the UK. So social Europe was a great slogan, and many people were entering Europe with the belief that it was a welfare state, a welfare union. But of course, welfare is still at the level of nation states, and we might think about solutions such way of unemployment insurance. We call it the dole or unemployment benefit. But these are large-scale benefits and very difficult projects. Take the different level of life or standard of living. Unemployment insurance in Bulgaria would be very different from the same insurance in Germany. But at least this would help people feel that they do derive some benefit from being in the EU, and especially people who are really in dire straits, such as the unemployed. Maybe we haven't really provided an answer, and I'm not sure if we're able to answer your question, but my understanding is that the beginnings of EU integration were propelled by the desire to change Europe to avoid wars. That was, simply speaking, the great idea. For us, who joined the EU, we were beneficiaries. We entered normal life, and we joined the West. So I think your question actually is about the generations who already have it. They don't really see any checks at the border, and they are not surprised because they don't know any other. So I'm thinking about some idea that could really carry people away. In 2016, we are actually living under threat. Certain things that were considered as a given might actually end, because people used to believe there are no borderlines, and there is a threat such as people are afraid of the war, and the EU is not able to protect us from something that it has seemingly eliminated. Despite the great improvement in the living standards, there are huge differences across the EU, and that propels frustration. But of course, 12 years is not enough to really catch up. And of course, people's aspirations always grow much faster than reality. This is almost a normal trend. Anyway, roaming fees, these are an idea that actually could appeal to me. Well, when you go to Kaliningrad, then you pay €4 a minute. But everyone travels to EU and they pay 1 zloty, which is 25 euro cents. But not too many people travel to Kaliningrad. Well, this might be a difference that we will see if borders are reinstated, if they are reinstated. Why are there national movements emerging across Europe? It's just a problem of identity and the problem of migrants who are just bringing a new identity to Europe. So the European identity, which was strong post-war, now it's really dispersed. For Schumann and Adenauer, it could have been morality, Jewish and Christian morality, and Greek and Latin philosophy. Now we're not really speaking about this now, and I'm talking about the Enlightenment period. It was the Freemasons who did that. I'm speaking about this, sorry, but I have to. But even if we consider the human rights and rights of the individual, well, for Muslim communities who are present in Europe, this is actually a very different perspective. People who are threatened in their identity, they seek a strong identity. Does the EU offer a strong identity? Well, I doubt it. Should it be pan-European identity? Is that strong enough to guarantee a victory in debates with Muslims? Of course not. Certainly it shouldn't really be, let's defend what we have, like roaming and borderlines and smaller things. This is not really going to influence young people, because they will not defend things that they consider obvious. De Gasperi, Adenauer and Schumann, they agreed on many things, but I cannot really see Orban, Kaczynski and Angela Merkel sitting at the same table and talk. They actually use these ideas as a political ritual. Well, Schumann and the founding fathers of the EU, they believed in God. Now we have no statesmen, because democracy prevents statement, because politicians have to appeal to the crowds. Well, the EU was actually trying to prevent statesmen such as Adolf Hitler. Let's go back to questions from the audience.
Of European Commission, European Union ordering some type of an inquiry on the type of policies that Poland is following. Now, if you look at the larger context, I think if you are creating an entity like European Union, it is natural that at any point of time, some countries might be the losers, some countries might be the gainers. So if every country starts whipping up the national identities and then national sentiments because they have lost at a particular point of time, how can the nations support this type of an identity of the European Union? Can this survive in the long run? According to my opinion, if the European Union survives in the long run, it would benefit all the nations. Maybe historically at some point of time, some nations might lose. But in the long run, I think everybody would be the gainers.
Znaczy, po polsku powiedzieć, czy...
No, bo jest tłumaczenie.
Tak, okej.
Tylko wolniej może.
Znaczy, ja się zgadzam.
Well, I do agree that in the long run, everybody or all nations would be beneficiaries if the EU survives, as long as the EU is structured differently. Remember, when the Eurozone was being created, the prevailing narrative which we had was that it was not going to benefit everyone, but there will be convergence, meaning all the living standards will come closer together in all European countries, because this is what people are interested about, and maybe some difficulties will be eliminated. So the common currency, common market, and structural funds for redistribution. The structural funds somehow have helped Poland. They probably have helped countries in the East. When the Eurozone was created, well, the southern countries were no longer getting help because they were beneficiaries at a different moment, and we saw a split, a stratification rather than convergence, and this economic model cannot be maintained because one country, such as Germany, that has export surplus, wins this surplus at the expense of other countries that import goods. So the balance of payments in trade is actually crucial. Now, Germans actually exported that unemployment there. So without changing the economic structure, I think, and this is just one of the crises that we mentioned, but I think it's probably the second most important crisis next to the immigration crisis or refugee crisis. So without a greater focus on redistribution and equality in income, it will be very difficult to hold it all together, economically speaking. Let me go back to the very beginning. And of course, there was this great idea of Europe, and the founding fathers had it. However, the functionalist paradigm was based on pragmatic integration between different sectors. It wasn't an accident that it was a European community of steel and coal, plus then we had agriculture and commerce. And it worked like this for a number of decades. Culture was, and I mean European culture, was largely a matter of, that was of interest to intellectuals, because this matter was handled at the national level. Charles de Gaulle and the French politicians would have had a good laugh if they had that they were supposed to promote European culture, because after all, French culture is best. And European integration is about steel and coal and subsidies for farmers. Let me give you a reminder. This is a very good question that you made, the comment that you made. The EU was a rescue of the nation state. It was a way to save the condition of countries so that countries could integrate. So this project cannot work if we go back to the old times. So somebody said it in the panel. Nowadays, countries are suspended as they cannot really integrate further, but they couldn't really turn their back on the EU. It's not the case that nation states are actually in a backlash. The situation is different, but the 2008 economic crisis really did change a lot. The pendulum, which really swung towards the market, and after 2008 it went back strongly towards the state and the government, and even was that a papal encyclical, and even the papal documents, there was this idea of having a global government as a way to correspond to multinational corporations. Well, the global government has not been created, so nobody can defend us against global capitalism. That's why we need to have a European government, perhaps. But there is yet a different problem. 2008, on the one hand, shifted the pendulum towards the government, but on the other hand, governments were not always very good decision makers in economic matters. I think when it comes to economy, it's a matter of distrust in national and supranational structures. Plus, there have been the multinational corporations that were an example seemingly solving governmental problems. Since 2008, we haven't had an institution that we would fully trust to make our dreams come true. The EU actually had this trust until that date, but it didn't handle the crisis well. You have another question? Please go ahead. I would like to ask the following. Today it might sound too ambitious, perhaps, but maybe this question is still quite appropriate. Maybe Poland could make a greater contribution to solving EU problems, because after all, we're going to really be counted with, we're going to play an important role if we have ideas, if we can create coalitions to pursue those ideas and then promote them. I think this would be very much of a corresponding idea that addresses current problems. If we're thinking about Poland's being outside the Eurozone, and if we think about the post-crisis era, we have a wing of economic integration in the EU, like the supervision at the European Central Bank, Eurogroup in general, and Poland is absent from those structures. And after all, this is an important part of this body, decision-making body of the EU. If Donald Tusk ceases to be the chairman and the president of the European Council, then we will have no access to any further decision-making powers. So this is something of importance for Poland's presence. I really do agree with you. Poland's reputation and constructive contribution has varied, but there have been a few projects that have been very successful. We can criticize them, looking back, but nevertheless, the Polish-Swedish collaboration in Eastern Partnership, the power sector, the Weimar Triangle and the collaboration in that, which was difficult. And I talked to Polish diplomats in Brussels and elsewhere, and they said, well, yes, it is difficult, because our partners are very powerful and they often speak to one another early and they bring some ready decisions onto the table, but we are there at the table and they listen to us. We are consulted. And then other countries from the region actually envied us, regretfully. Well, I don't know if that's regretfully or not, because you're sitting at a table where at least this was a perception that Poland did have an influence. Very often, even until certain things were decided. I'm not saying it was perfect, but if we can speak about being constructive only by building something in the Visegrad for, well, these are just illusions, and I'm sorry, the Visegrad countries are weak. They've always wanted to work with Poland, but they were afraid of Poland gaining local hegemony, and they spent some time in Europe, and they said, oh, Poland could be a link between ourselves and other partners. And for Poland, these are very important partners, but there are so many differences, and you really need to look for other allies. The Visegrad 4 is not enough, and after the dual majority was introduced, then even other countries are not enough, and the Weimar Triangle is a dead institution. Mr. Sikorski departed from this idea of Weimar Triangle after 2012, and the current foreign minister, in his introductory speech, actually didn't give much attention to that idea. So that was a disappointment, and there was hope that the Weimar Triangle would bring some benefits to Poland, but in fact it didn't. I would like Poland to make some suggestions, a proposal in the EU, and I think we should join forces with the region countries and propose some institutional reform, and I'm really missing some idea to coordinate that voice. But Poland had one very interesting idea which really fitted very well into the idea of European integration. It was called the element formula of voting, and a dual majority actually broke the idea of voting in the EU. It was one of the very few projects that came from Poland that was very strongly fitted into the integration. There was the digressive proportionality that came in. It was the mechanism of counting voices at the European Parliament, and Germany stifled that, and we were only supported by Lithuania and Czech Republic, and other countries got a very strong signal from Berlin, very much like Hungary, about sanctions, not to introduce that kind of root kind of system, and there were also some ideas to counteract the root system. And why would we bring the idea of root into this beautiful idea of EU integration? So whenever we come with good ideas to improve the subsidiarity and solidarity in the EU, it's not always the case that Poland gets support.
I will agree with you. And I'm quite critical to what Sikorski presented in the same. He showed a PowerPoint showing the votes of France, Great Britain, and on the other hand, the votes of the Visegrad Group. And this meant nothing for the European Union, because the Visegrad Group is really nothing when compared to the largest superpowers of the European Union. And when it comes to foreign affairs and security policy, there are almost no voting. All decisions are made by consensus. If we want to exert influence, we have to do it indirectly and not directly. And those elements are going to play an important role in the Council. I would like Poland to be an active player when shaping the European Union. Because very often we assumed some ready-made solutions, as was the case with the liberalism. And now we know that we have to reshape the European Union, rebuild the European Union. But I don't want Poland to suggest a structural reform of the European Union. There are certain coalitions within the European Union, because there are some skeptical countries. They are skeptical towards Brussels and towards how the European Union functions, and they would like the European Union to retreat from as many areas of life as possible. The problem is that the Polish ability to enter coalitions is quite low at the moment. Not because we don't have many votes, but because we are critical towards the mainstream presented by Brussels, and the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland have relatively little in common. There's one thing that Visegrad succeeded in lately. However, this is too little. The problem is that Poland, during the last 10 or 12 years, were trying to enter any kinds of alliances. For example, in the eastern flank of NATO, we were trying to build some relations with Bulgaria, for example. In the past, we had to be loyal towards the Western strong neighbor, which was Germany. And I think that Kaczynski and Sikorski had many things in common. They just expressed them in a different way. They wanted to strengthen the position of Poland within the European Union. Sometimes it's worth suggesting some solutions, even if they are not going to be implemented. However, in real political terms, Poland has to wait for what's going to happen in 2016, because our relations within the European Union are going to be shaped in a different way if Great Britain leaves the European Union. I'm skeptical when it comes to believing that the Visegrad Group is coherent and uniform. Maybe this results from my experiences of the Copenhagen summit, the summit that marked the end of negotiations. There was Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic, and they wanted to integrate. And this concerned some issues related to milk. We have to learn to build alliances, to strike deals in particular matters. And there's no body that's going to support us in any situation. Yes, there are no permanent alliances. There are only like-minded groups. The last question. No questions? There is one more question.
Dzień dobry.
Good afternoon. Monika Turkowska. Jankowski University in Warsaw. As we all know, from the 1st of May to 2004, Poland is a member of the European Union. As a result, we've got some rights and some duties. My question relates to what's the awareness of the citizens of Poland when it comes to the refugee policy. Of course, we have to accept some refugees, that's our obligations. However, Polish people cannot come to terms with this. Well, we've talked about this a bit already. However, it's not only Poland that is apprehensive towards accepting refugees. Even in the European Parliament, representatives of the political group, for example, Angela Merkel, this is the European People's Party, representatives from Slovakia, from Hungary, because Fidesz is also a member of this group, they openly say that it's not about their personal views, but about their nations being reluctant towards accepting refugees, which means that it's not only Poles that are so skeptical towards accepting refugees. And what's the reason for that? Why aren't only Poles skeptical towards refugees? Why Poles? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't understand it. I don't get it. It seems to me that if the Polish political elites, if Kędzierski says today, we are going to accept 30,000 refugees, and then in return, Germany has to take a stance on the Nord Stream 2, then a lot of Polish people would say, we've always supported accepting refugees. However, I understand that a lot of people are apprehensive towards accepting refugees. And let me say that the politicians of 3 different fractions in Bundestag asked me the same question. What's the compromise according to Poland when it comes to refugees and Nord Stream? Would Poland want to accept refugees in exchange for a stance of the German government on Nord Stream? Maybe this is a kind of option, this is a kind of a deal that would be beneficial for all the parties. Let me say the following. The Polish government was ready to do that, to accept refugees. Well, the panelists are so engaged in the discussions that they're not willing to end it. I'm going to sum the discussion up and answer the last question. It seems to me, and you've mentioned that, it seems to me that the biggest role in what's going to happen in the future is played by the media. There are so many misunderstandings, lies said about the European Union and how it functions, how much it lacks democracy, and so on and so forth. I always hear the media say Brussels forces us to do something. What number should I call when I call the European Union? What does it mean, Brussels? Unfortunately, the majority of the most popular media, tabloids, they are dominated by anti-European publishing houses. it is the famous Australian Rupert Murdoch who hates the European Union. That's the owner of these tabloids. And when we have a look at the texts published in this press, a lot of work is done there to destroy the idea of the European integration. And if we cannot get our message through, get the real pieces of information through, we will really have a problem. And now I will ask you to close these 2 days' debates. Thank you so much. We would like to ask the members of our organization to the stage. All of you, please come to the stage. As you know, this has been the last panel debate of this event called World Under Scrutiny. These are representatives, not all the representatives of our foundations that were engaged in the organization of this event. I would like to extend my thanks to you for your work, which took almost a year. It took us almost a year to prepare this meeting. We all knew one another, however, we got to know one another even better during organizing this event. We're afraid of big words, however, we hope that this was just the first time, and we hope that next year we'll be able to invite you to the next edition of this event. We will be planning this event next year. We would like to extend our thanks to partner organizations which enabled this event to be held, and they also contributed with exhibitions, film displays, and so on and so forth. I would like to extend my thanks to all the panelists that took part in all the panel discussions during these 2 days, and they were eager to share their knowledge and expertise at the weekend. I can't imagine a better 4th of July, the 25th anniversary of the free elections of 1989 in Poland. We were able to exchange views on Europe, on the world, on the place of Poland in the world, in a very diversified community. We've had lots of panelists, and this is very symbolic for me to spend the 4th of June together with you. I couldn't imagine a better activity on the 4th of June. And I would like to thank all of you present in this room. You represent almost 500 participants of this event. The weather is beautiful and there are lots of things going on in Warsaw at the weekend. However, you decided to be with us, and I hope we will be able to invite you to next year's event, but this has to wait a bit. Thank you once again on behalf of the European Council of Foreign Relations and the Heinrich Böll Foundation, especially those of you who came from very distant places. We have our guests from Germany, from the Zeit Foundation. We're really glad you were with us today. We wish you a pleasant stay in Poland, and I would like to thank interpreters, especially, and I would like to say sorry to interpreters. I know that Michał and other participants talk really fast, and you did a great job. Thank you.